Do you believe the West was won by guns and blood or by the cold numbers inside a ledger? The courthouse bell counted 8 chimes as Martha Crane traced her finger down the ledger's columns. Each entry told a story: wages earned, supplies bought, lives measured in silver and sweat. The leather binding bore water stains from last spring's flood, but the pages remained crisp, her handwriting steady as scripture. "Morning, Martha." Doc Henley pushed through the door, stamping snow from his boots, came for the medicine account. She turned to page 47 without looking up. $17.60. Mrs. Patterson's laudanum and the splints for young Tommy Walsh. Doc fumbled with his coin purse. "Town's grateful for your bookkeeping. Makes everything square." Martha nodded, entering the payment. Outside, the mine whistle gave its morning blast 7:30 sharp. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, promising another day of silver pulled from stone. She glanced toward the window where icicles hung like prison bars from the eaves. "Doc, what happens when the law fails?" He paused, one boot half-laced. "Reckon that depends on who's asking." Before she could answer, boots thundered across the boardwalk. Jake Morrison burst in, his face flushed with anger and cold. Snow clung to his wool coat, and his right hand rested on his gun belt, a habit she'd grown to hate. "They did it, Martha. Posted the notice this morning." He threw a crumpled paper on her desk. "Foreman's giving the Broken Creek claim to that snake Dalton. Says our paperwork ain't proper." Martha smoothed the notice. The territorial seal looked official enough, but the signature belonged to a man who'd never set foot in Colorado. Her stomach tightened as she read the legal language, dense, deliberate, designed to confuse. "This can't be right. Your father filed that claim in '82. 3 years of work, Martha. 3 years of blasting and hauling, and they're handing it over like it's nothing." Jake's voice cracked. "Dalton's been spreading money around, buying himself a judge." Doc Henley cleared his throat. "Now hold on, Jake. There's proper channels." "Proper channels?" Jake's laugh held no humor. "Like the proper channel that got my father killed in Dalton's shaft. Like the proper channel that's kept his killer walking free." Martha closed the ledger with a soft snap. The sound seemed to echo in the small office. "Violence won't restore your claim, Jake Morrison. Neither will ledger keeping." The words stung, but she'd heard them before. Since her husband's death 2 years past, half the town treated her like a relic, useful for tracking debts but powerless when real decisions needed making. The other half saw her as some kind of miracle worker, able to solve problems with careful bookkeeping and stern words. Jake pulled a silver hammer from his belt, the same tool his father had used to test ore samples. The metal caught the morning light streaming through the frost-covered window. "This here's the only law that matters in these mountains." "That's not law, Jake. That's just revenge. Sometimes they're the same thing." The mine whistle sounded again, 2 short blasts followed by one long emergency signal. Doc Henley moved to the window, peering through the ice patterns toward the mine entrance. "Something's wrong at the Broken Creek shaft." He grabbed his medical bag. "Martha, you'd best come. They'll need your records if there's been an accident." Martha tucked the ledger under her arm, its familiar weight a comfort against the growing dread. As they stepped into the bitter morning air, she noticed the water trickling down the canyon walls more than usual for February, even with the recent warm spell. The image of Jake's silver hammer stayed with her as they hurried toward the mine, its polished surface reflecting a choice she wasn't ready to make. Water seeped through the mine office floorboards as Martha spread the claim documents across her desk. The territorial judge wouldn't arrive until noon, giving them barely 4 hours to sort through 3 years of paperwork and a lifetime of grudges. "These signatures don't match." She held up 2 documents, comparing the territorial agent's mark. "Someone's been forging papers." Jake paced the small office, his silver hammer tapping against his leg. "Proof won't matter if we're all underwater. That spring runoff's coming early this year." Through the window, Martha watched miners emerge from the shaft, their faces grim. Water followed them up the wooden ladders, each drop counting down to disaster. The Broken Creek mine sat at the lowest point in the canyon when the seasonal floods came. They came here first. "Mrs. Crane?" A woman's voice called from the doorway. Mary Patterson stepped inside, her widow's dress spotless despite the muddy streets. She carried a carpet bag that clinked with each step. I heard about the trouble. Martha looked up from the documents. Mary's husband had died in the same cave-in that killed Jake's father, another victim of Dalton's corner-cutting ways. The mine owner had paid for the funeral, but never admitted fault. "What's in the bag, Mary?" The widow set it on the desk with careful precision. Evidence. Tom kept copies of everything: safety reports, inspection records, payroll sheets. He knew Dalton was cooking the books. Jake stopped pacing. "Why didn't you bring this forward before?" Mary's hands trembled as she opened the bag. "Because I was scared. Because I needed Dalton's death benefit to keep food on my table. Because sometimes survival matters more than justice." Martha began sorting through the papers. Each document painted a clearer picture of systematic fraud, forged inspections, falsified safety reports, workers paid in company scrip instead of real silver. The silver hammer on Jake's belt caught her eye, and she remembered something. "Jake, your father's hammer. Did he use it to test more than ore?" "What do you mean?" "Tom Patterson mentions it here." She held up a letter. "Says, your father discovered the silver content was lower than Dalton claimed. That's why he wanted to buy out the claim, not because it was worthless, but because Dalton was lying about what it contained." The mine whistle shrieked 3 times, water rising faster. Outside, men shouted orders and hauled equipment up the canyon slope. Time was running out, but the pieces were finally coming together. Mary reached into her bag one more time, pulling out a small leather pouch. Tom's final assay samples. He tested the ore the night before the cave-in. The silver content was 3 times what Dalton reported to the territorial office. Jake hefted his father's hammer, understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't trying to cheat us out of our claim. He was trying to steal it. Martha gathered the papers, her ledger tucked securely under one arm. "Then we take this to Judge Campbell when he arrives. Let the law handle Dalton. And if the law's been bought too?" Before she could answer, the office door slammed open. 3 men in long coats stepped inside, water dripping from their boots. The leader wore a territorial marshal's badge, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a hired gun. "Mrs. Crane." "Mr. Morrison, I'm Marshal Wade, Territorial Authority. I'm here about some disputed property." Martha felt the ledger's weight against her ribs. "The judge isn't due until—" "Judge Campbell's been delayed. Flash flooding on the eastern pass." Wade smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Lucky thing I was in the area. I can settle this claim dispute right now." Jake's hand moved toward his gun belt, but Martha stepped between them. The silver hammer gleamed in the morning light, and she could see Jake weighing his choices: law or violence, patience or action. The water continued to rise. Martha stood in the center of her office, surrounded by documents and the smell of rising water. The choice before her felt as clear as the numbers in her ledger: trust the corrupt marshal or help Jake take the law into his own hands. She looked at Mary Patterson, who clutched her dead husband's evidence like a lifeline; at Jake Morrison, whose father's silver hammer represented both justice and violence; at Marshal Wade, whose badge meant nothing in a territory where money bought verdicts. "Marshal Wade," Martha said, her voice steady as church bells. "I'd like to show you something." She opened her ledger to a specific page, one she'd prepared for this moment. The entry showed a payment made 3 months ago. J. Dalton, territorial fees, $500. Below it, another entry. J. Dalton Marshal Services, $200. Wade's face went pale. "That's just routine. Routine payments to fix a land grab." Martha closed the ledger. "Tom Patterson's records show you've been taking Dalton's money for over a year." Mary stepped forward, her carpet bag open. "Tom documented every payment, every forged signature, every time you looked the other way when safety violations killed good men." Jake's hammer caught the light as he moved closer to Wade. "My father died because you let Dalton cut corners. How many more have to die for your 30 pieces of silver?" For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Martha could see Jake's finger flecks near his gun, could smell the marshal's fear mixing with the damp scent of floodwater. This was the moment her husband would have reached for his own weapon, would have let frontier justice take its bloody course. Instead, she opened her ledger to a fresh page and began to write. Marshall Wade, I'm entering your confession into the official record. Your choice is simple: sign it and face territorial justice, or explain to Judge Campbell why you refuse to acknowledge documented evidence of corruption. Wade looked at the three of them, a determined bookkeeper, a grieving widow, and an angry young man with a hammer and a gun. The sound of rising water filled the silence. You can't prove anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Martha turned the ledger toward him, her pen still moving across the page. Tom Patterson's records prove you took Dalton's money. My books show when those payments were made. Mary's testimony puts you at the scene of every suspicious accident. She paused, looking directly into Wade's eyes. The question isn't whether we can prove it. The question is whether you want to face a territorial court or explain things to Jake's hammer. Jake stepped closer, the silver tool spinning slowly in his grip. My choice is simpler, Marshall. Justice by law or justice by lead. Martha placed her hand gently on Jake's arm. Justice by ledger. Jake. Clean, documented, permanent. The water rose another inch outside, but inside the office, something shifted. Martha felt the weight of choice settle into her bones, not the violent justice of the frontier, but the patient justice of law and order and careful record-keeping. She belonged here, in this moment, with her pen and her ledger and her absolute faith that truth, properly documented, could outlast any lie. The water climbed past the office windowsill as Martha transcribed Wade's confession. Each word felt like a nail in Dalton's coffin, but time was running short. Outside, miners hauled the last of the equipment up the canyon slope, while the flood turned Broken Creek into a roaring torrent. Judge Campbell's coach just cleared the eastern pass. Doc Henley called through the door. Hour and a half? Maybe 2. Martha looked up from her ledger. The confession filled 2 pages now: Wade's admission of bribery, his detailed account of Dalton's illegal land grabs, his signature growing shakier with each line. But paper meant nothing if the mine flooded before the judge arrived. Marshall, you're going to help us evacuate the powder magazine. Wade shook his head. I'm not going back in there. That shaft's ready to collapse. Jake spun his father's hammer between his fingers. Funny thing about justice, Marshall. Sometimes it involves getting your hands dirty. Through the rising water came a new sound, the rumble of dynamite charges deeper in the mine. Martha grabbed her ledger and Mary's evidence bag as the office floorboards buckled upward. Dalton's trying to collapse the shaft, she realized. Destroy the evidence and blame it on the flood. Jake was already moving toward the door, his gun drawn. Not if I stop him first. Jake, wait. Martha caught his arm. Violence won't preserve the evidence. We need those samples and records intact for the judge. Then, what do you suggest? Ask him politely to stop blowing up the mine. Martha looked at her ledger, then at the rising water, then at the silver hammer in Jake's belt. An idea formed, dangerous but precise, like a perfectly balanced set of books. Mary, do you still have Tom's sample back? The widow nodded, clutching the leather pouch. Every piece he tested the night he died. Jake, I need your hammer. Not for violence, for proof. She took the silver tool and felt its weight. Tom Patterson had used it to test ore samples to measure the true value of what lay hidden in the rock. Jake's father had used the same hammer to discover Dalton's lies about the claim's worth. Another explosion shook the mine. Water burst through the office door, carrying mud and debris. Martha tucked the ledger inside her coat and waded toward the mine entrance. Mrs. Crane, what are you doing? Doc Henley sloshed through the floodwater behind them, saving the evidence. She held up the hammer. Tom's samples prove the silver content. If we can get fresh samples from the same vein before Dalton destroys it, we'll have proof that can't be denied. Jake splashed alongside her. That's suicide, Martha. The whole place is flooding. So is letting Dalton win. They reached the mine entrance as another charge detonated deep underground. Water poured from the shaft like blood from a wound, but Martha could see torchlight flickering in the depths. Someone was still down there, still setting charges. Jake checked his gun. I'm going after him. We're going after the evidence. Martha started down the wooden ladder, her ledger pressed against her chest. Mary, stay here with Doc. Guard the confession. The ladder rungs were slick with mud and water. Each step down took them deeper into danger, but Martha felt a strange calm settle over her. This was like balancing books. Every action had to equal and opposite reaction, every risk measured against its potential reward. 20 feet down, they found Dalton. He crouched beside a stack of dynamite, his fingers working to light a fuse. Water swirled around his waist, and his face showed the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed lies crumble. "Dalton." Jake's voice echoed in the narrow shaft. "Step away from the charges." The mine owner looked up, his eyes wild in the torchlight. "Morrison. Should have known you'd crawl down here like your father did. Look how that turned out." Jake raised his gun, but Martha moved between them. The silver hammer felt solid in her grip, its purpose clear. "Mr. Dalton, I have Wade's confession, Tom Patterson's evidence, Mary's testimony. Your scheme is finished. Evidence burns, Mrs. Crane. Witness disappear. Ledger get lost in floods." He struck a match. Martha swung the hammer, not at Dalton, but at the torch bracket on the tunnel wall. The light went out, plunging them into darkness. In the confusion, she heard Jake tackle the mine owner, heard the match hiss as it hit the water. When Doc Henley's lantern found them 5 minutes later, Dalton sat tied with rope from the equipment shed, and Martha was chipping fresh samples from the exposed silver vein with Jake's father's hammer. "Still think the ledger's mightier than the gun?" Jake asked, wringing water from his shirt. Martha held up a piece of ore, its silver content gleaming in the lantern light. "Depends on how you use it." The sound of coach wheels echoed down the canyon. Judge Campbell had arrived, and Martha had her evidence documented, witnessed, and extracted from the very rock that Dalton had tried to destroy. Judge Campbell's gavel rang out across the makeshift courtroom in the Broken Creek schoolhouse. Water still seeped through the floorboards, but the flood had passed, leaving behind the scent of mud and the promise of justice long delayed. Martha sat in the front row, her ledger open on her lap. The water-stained pages told their story in precise columns, every bribe documented, every illegal payment recorded, every life lost to Dalton's greed given its proper accounting. "Mrs. Crane," Judge Campbell called, "please present your evidence to the court." She stood, feeling the weight of the community's attention. Miners filled the benches behind her, their faces showing 3 years of suppressed anger and hope. Mary Patterson sat with Tom's evidence bag. Jake Morrison held his father's silver hammer, but his gun remained holstered. "Your Honor, the territorial records show that Marcus Dalton filed false assay reports to conceal the true value of the Broken Creek claim." Martha opened her ledger to page 63. "My book's record payments totaling $700 made by Mr. Dalton to Marshall Wade over the past 14 months. She held up Tom Patterson's ore samples, their silver content gleaming in the afternoon light. These samples, tested the night before Tom Patterson's death, prove the claim contains silver worth $15,000, not the worthless rock Mr. Dalton claimed when he tried to purchase it. Judge Campbell examined the samples. "And you obtained fresh samples from the same vein yesterday, using this hammer." Martha lifted Jake's father's tool, the same instrument both Tom Patterson and Samuel Morrison used to discover Mr. Dalton's deception. The silver content matches exactly. Dalton's lawyer, a thin man from Denver, stood up. "Your Honor, Mrs. Crane is not a qualified assayer. Her bookkeeping hardly constitutes legal evidence." "Bookkeeping," Martha repeated, her voice carrying across the packed schoolhouse. "Mr. Dalton, would you like to see what proper bookkeeping reveals?" She turned to a different page in her ledger. "March 15th, 1884. Payment to the Territorial Office, $50 to expedite the Morrison claim transfer, but the territorial records show no such payment was received." Another page. June 10th, 1884. Safety inspection fee, $25, paid to Inspector Williams. But Inspector Williams died in Denver 2 months earlier. Judge Campbell leaned forward. "Continue, Mrs. Crane. Every forged document, every false payment, every life lost to corner cutting, all recorded in Mr. Dalton's own ledgers, which Marshall Wade provided as evidence of his cooperation with the territorial court." She closed her ledger with a decisive snap. Justice doesn't require violence, Your Honor. It requires precision. Dalton stood up, his face flushed with rage. That's enough. You think your little numbers can destroy everything I've built? I own half this territory. You owned it, Jake Morrison said, rising from his seat. The silver hammer gleamed in his hand, but instead of raising it as a weapon, he set it gently on the judge's table. This belonged to my father. He used it to test the truth of things. Mrs. Crane used it the same way. Martha felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that justice could be both gentle and implacable, like water wearing down stone. Your Honor, I request that the Morrison claim be restored to its rightful owners, and that Mr. Dalton face territorial charges for fraud, bribery, and criminal negligence in the deaths of Samuel Morrison and Tom Patterson. The judge's gavel fell like thunder. So, ordered. Mr. Dalton, you'll be transported to Denver to await trial. The Morrison claim is hereby restored, with damages to be determined by territorial assessment. The schoolhouse erupted in cheers. Martha felt hands clapping her shoulders, heard voices calling her name, but her attention focused on Jake Morrison, who had tears in his eyes as he picked up his father's hammer. Thank you, he said simply. Thank the ledger, Martha replied, but she was smiling. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see the sun setting over the canyon, painting the snow-covered peaks gold and silver. The floodwaters had receded, leaving the ground clean and ready for new growth. Mary Patterson approached with her evidence bag. What should I do with Tom's records? Martha opened her ledger to a fresh page. We preserve them. Every page, every receipt, every proof that good men lived and worked and mattered. She began writing. The truth deserves its own accounting. As the crowd filed out into the evening air, Martha remained at the schoolhouse desk, her pen moving steadily across the page. She was recording not just numbers now, but names, stories, the careful documentation of justice served and promises kept. Jake's hammer lay beside her ledger, two tools that had found their proper purpose not in violence, but in the patient work of truth. 1 month later, Martha Crane stood outside the new Broken Creek mining office, watching Jake Morrison test a fresh ore sample with his father's silver hammer. The spring runoff flowed clear and steady past the mine entrance, carrying away the last traces of winter's ice. 15 ounces per ton, Jake announced, holding up the gleaming rock. Dad would have been proud. Martha entered the results in her ledger, the same water-stained book that had survived flood and fraud and the weight of justice deferred. But the pages looked different now, filled not just with debts and payments, but with the names of men who had found honest work in an honest mine. Mary Patterson approached from the new company office, her widow's dress replaced by practical work clothes. As the mine's new safety inspector, she carried Tom's old equipment bag filled with proper testing tools instead of hidden evidence. Morning reports, Mrs. Crane. Mary handed over a clipboard. Every timber checked, every support beam measured. By the book, the way it should be. Martha copied the safety figures into her ledger, each entry a small victory over the chaos that had nearly destroyed them all. A stagecoach clattered down the canyon road, carrying supplies and mail from Denver. Among the packages was the official territorial document bearing Judge Campbell's seal confirmation that Marcus Dalton had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, his stolen assets seized and distributed among his victims' families. Jake hefted his father's hammer, feeling its familiar weight. Think we'll have any more trouble with claim jumpers? Martha smiled, closing her ledger. The leather binding bore new water stains from their underground adventure, but the pages remained crisp, her handwriting as steady as ever. Not if they have to answer to proper bookkeeping. The mine whistle sounded the end of the workday, not the frantic emergency blasts of a month ago, but the steady, reliable rhythm of honest labor. Men emerged from the shaft carrying silver that would be fairly assayed, properly recorded, and justly shared. As the sun set over the canyon, Martha walked home through streets that felt safer, cleaner, measured by something more lasting than fear or greed. Her ledger, tucked under her arm, contained more than numbers now. It held the promise that truth, carefully recorded and patiently preserved, could outlast any lie. The promise had been kept, not by the gun, but by the ledger. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.